In recent weeks, Africa has witnessed a moment that many are calling historic. Raila Odinga, the veteran statesman and former Prime Minister of Kenya, stunned an international audience with words that broke decades of silence. Calm but unflinching, he stood before diplomats and leaders and declared that democracy is being rejected even in its cradle. The room fell silent, not because people were shocked, but because they knew he was speaking a truth too long ignored. For generations, Africans were told that the Western model of governance was the only path to freedom and dignity. Elections, term limits, donor-driven reforms, and international monitors were presented as the gold standard. Yet Odinga raised a piercing question. If ballots do not feed the hungry, if votes do not guarantee clean water, jobs, or reliable electricity, can we still call it democracy? His words did not come from an angry radical. They came from a man who once embodied the democratic tradition itself, a leader many believed would become the next chair of the African Union. That is what made his statement so powerful. Odinga reminded the world that political democracy, as imported from the West, was never truly adapted to Africa's history, culture, or economic realities. It was imposed, not chosen. For decades it became a ritual, a performance staged for donors rather than a mechanism to deliver dignity. And while African nations performed these rituals, the living conditions of ordinary people barely changed. Roads remained broken, hospitals lacked electricity, schools were underfunded, and poverty remained stubbornly high. His speech also highlighted a deeper paradox. Western nations continue to present themselves as champions of democracy, yet in their own countries, democratic trust is eroding. Odinga pointed to populism, voter suppression, and declining confidence in institutions across Europe and the United States. If the model is struggling at home, he asked, why should Africa be forced to import it? That question landed heavily, because it exposed a credibility crisis for Western capitals. Perhaps the most striking element of Odinga's speech was how it resonated with Africa's youth. 70% of the continent's population is under the age of 35. This generation has grown up with slogans of democracy, but little evidence of its benefits. They do not celebrate elections. They march in the streets demanding jobs, food security, and sovereignty. In Lagos, Bamako, Nairobi, and Ouagadougou, their chants echo the same message: dignity cannot be imported. By uttering a single line, Odinga shifted the political atmosphere across the continent. He did not call for violence or revolution, but he gave legitimacy to a question many young Africans already whispered. What if this system was never meant to work here in the first place? That question alone has the power to reshape Africa's future. Raila Odinga's speech did not sound like a concession from a defeated candidate. It sounded like a reckoning. For decades, he had been a faithful steward of democratic tradition in East Africa, often praised for his moderation and his connections to Western capitals. Yet in this moment, he chose to dismantle the very system he once defended. His words cut deep because they exposed a paradox at the heart of African governance: the appearance of democracy without the substance of dignity. The setting amplified the impact. Odinga spoke at a formal policy forum after losing the race to become chairperson of the African Union. Many expected a polite thank you or a speech about unity. Instead, he delivered a critique that divided the room. Calm and deliberate, he declared that Western-style political democracy had never been adapted to Africa's traditions, that it was imposed as an experiment, rather than chosen as a tool for genuine self-governance. For diplomats accustomed to polished phrases about reforms and partnership, his words landed like a thunderclap. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Across the continent, elections are expensive rituals that drain public coffers, yet bring little change to ordinary lives. Ballots are cast, observers write reports, presidents make speeches, and then daily reality resumes. Unreliable electricity, fragile health systems, schools without resources, and young graduates searching desperately for work. Odinga's point was clear. A system that does not deliver basic human dignity is not a system worth preserving simply for its symbolism. What made this moment even more powerful was the context of global democratic decline. In Europe and the United States, faith in democratic institutions has been shaken. Populist movements rise, voter suppression is debated, and public trust is falling. Odinga's reminder that democracy is being rejected, even in its cradle, struck hard because it framed Africa's struggle not as an exception, but as part of a global crisis. If the architects of the model cannot sustain it at home, why should Africans continue to copy it abroad? The reaction across Africa was swift. Youth groups in Nairobi created side-by-side videos comparing Odinga with Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. One man wore a suit, the other a beret, but their message seemed united. Africa must chart its own path. In Accra and Dar es Salaam, murals appeared with Odinga's quote. At universities, students organized readings of his remarks, treating them as a manifesto for a new era. In the Sahel, where military leaders in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso had already broken with France and the United States, Odinga's words were seized upon as ideological reinforcement. State television in Mali broadcast his speech with local subtitles, framing it as proof that even civilian democratic veterans now question the imposed model. In Burkina Faso, state media paired clips of Odinga with footage of Thomas Sankara, symbolizing a bridge between past and present resistance. Within the African Union, the response was far more cautious. Diplomats avoided public applause or condemnation, but reports suggest divisions ran deep behind closed doors. Some feared his words would embolden anti-Western sentiment, further isolating the AU from Europe and the United States. Others saw it as a necessary moment of truth, a signal that Africa must stop performing for donor approval and start governing for its own people. Western reactions were muted but telling. In Washington, the State Department issued a bland statement affirming support for democratic institutions, but internal think tank reports described Odinga's remarks as a credibility rupture. European officials labeled the speech destabilizing in private, but their own analysts admitted that Africa's disillusionment is rooted in real grievances. What alarmed Western strategists most was that Odinga, unlike younger military leaders, had long been their trusted ally. If even he could question the model publicly, then the ideological high ground was slipping away. Meanwhile, Beijing and Moscow reacted with opportunity rather than anxiety. Chinese state media framed Odinga's words as validation of their philosophy that each region must choose its own development path. Russian broadcasters compared Odinga and Traoré as voices of sovereignty in a multipolar world. Unlike the West, both powers followed up with offers rather than lectures, from infrastructure partnerships to policy forums. For millions of young Africans, however, the power of Odinga's speech was not about great power competition. It was about honesty. It was about a leader finally speaking the words that reflected their daily frustrations. To them, imported democracy feels less like freedom and more like performance. And when performance fails to bring food to the table or jobs to the youth, it loses all legitimacy. This is why Odinga's statement matters. He did not provide a blueprint for Africa's future. He did something even more radical. He asked a question. What if the model was never meant to work here? That question resonates across classrooms, marketplaces, and social media feeds, forcing a generation to consider what comes next if Africa dares to define governance on its own terms. The shockwaves from Raila Odinga's words did not remain inside the conference hall. They rippled outward, shaking capitals from Nairobi to Washington. What made his statement extraordinary was not only the content, but also the source. Odinga was not a young radical in fatigues, but a seasoned politician with decades of credibility. For the West, this made the challenge far more dangerous. In Nairobi, the immediate reaction was mixed. Members of the political class scrambled to respond. Some condemned Odinga for undermining democratic values, accusing him of betraying his own legacy. Others, including younger parliamentarians, admitted privately that he had voiced what many already knew, that democracy as practiced in Africa had become little more than a stage performance for international approval. For Kenya's youth, the message was electrifying. Within hours, campus groups began circulating his quotes across social media. Public parks filled with impromptu debates. Murals appeared in Nairobi's streets, pairing Odinga's face with slogans like, "Democracy without dignity is no democracy." Across the Sahel, the speech landed with almost prophetic weight. In Mali and Niger, state television replayed Odinga's remarks alongside speeches from Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani. The symbolism was unmistakable. Here was a veteran Democrat echoing the frustrations of younger military leaders who had already defied Western influence. In Burkina Faso, broadcasters paired Odinga's lines with footage of Thomas Sankara, creating a narrative arc that linked past, present, and future. Ordinary citizens interpreted this not as a coincidence, but as evidence of continental awakening. In Ghana and Nigeria, reactions were more cautious, but no less telling. Politicians avoided direct endorsement, yet their speeches began including references to African Democracy 2.0. Civil society organizations in Accra hosted forums titled Democracy in Question, where Odinga's words were read aloud before heated discussions. In Lagos, graffiti artists painted ballot boxes cracking open to reveal chains rather than change. These were not random expressions of dissent. They were visual symbols of a generational disillusionment that Odinga had legitimized. Meanwhile, in the African Union corridors, silence masked turbulence. Diplomats avoided public comment, but reports suggest deep divisions. Reformist states from the Sahel quietly welcomed the intervention, interpreting it as cover for their experiments in sovereignty-based governance. More traditional states on the coast worried that the speech would fracture the AU, splitting the body between those who continued aligning with Western institutions and those ready to abandon the model altogether. The AU leadership found itself in an impossible position, unable to condemn Odinga without appearing out of touch, yet unwilling to endorse him for fear of alienating critical partners in Europe and the United States. Western capitals responded with a choreography of caution. Washington issued a generic statement reaffirming commitment to democracy in Africa. Brussels echoed with vague language about constructive dialogue. Yet behind the platitudes, internal memos revealed alarm. Analysts described Odinga's remarks as a credibility rupture, a moment when even the West's most reliable allies no longer defended the model publicly. The phrase Burkina Faso effect appeared in leaked documents, warning that what began with Traoré's defiance might now spread through respected democratic figures. A senior U.S. strategist was quoted privately as saying, "We are not just losing bases and contracts, we are losing the narrative itself." Beijing and Moscow, by contrast, saw opportunity. Chinese state media framed the speech as confirmation that Western-style governance had lost its global appeal. Commentators linked Odinga's message to Xi Jinping's philosophy that every region must choose its own development path. Russian outlets portrayed him as a statesman aligning, intentionally or not, with a multipolar world order that resists Western dominance. Unlike Washington or Brussels, neither power tried to question Odinga's legitimacy. They offered partnerships instead of prescriptions. Within weeks, Chinese officials proposed infrastructure deals to East African governments, while Russia invited young African leaders to policy forums in Moscow. The generational response across Africa was perhaps the most decisive. For millions of young Africans, Odinga's words did not feel like betrayal. They felt like validation. Generations raised on slogans about freedom and ballots had lived long enough to see little change in their daily lives. For them, elections had become performances where the actors changed, but the stage remained the same. Odinga's willingness to break the silence gave their frustration a voice. Student groups across universities in West and East Africa held vigils, debates, and forums under banners reading, "Democracy must deliver." In Bamako and Ouagadougou, youth soldiers circulated clips of his remarks as ideological fuel. Yet this moment was not only about Africa. Western analysts recognized the global implications. If democracy was being questioned in Africa, it was also being questioned in Europe and America. Odinga's reminder that democracy is being rejected in its cradle linked African frustration to global disillusionment. It framed Africa not as an exception, but as a mirror. For Western policymakers, this was deeply unsettling. It meant that their model was no longer unquestioned, even among allies. Civil society responses across Africa reflected the complexity of the debate. Human rights organizations warned against throwing away democratic frameworks entirely. They argued that criticism must not turn into dismissal. Yet even these groups acknowledged that something fundamental had to change. For once, even defenders of democracy admitted that the status quo was untenable. By the end of the week, Odinga's speech had shifted Africa's political discourse. What began as a concession address had become a manifesto of discontent. It validated the Sahel's defiance, challenged Western institutions, emboldened African youth, and forced leaders everywhere to ask uncomfortable questions. Whether Odinga intended it or not, he had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The silence was broken, and with it the illusion that Western-style democracy remained unchallenged on the continent. The long-term consequences of Raila Odinga's declaration are only beginning to unfold, but already the outlines of a new political landscape are becoming visible. His words did not just question the effectiveness of Western-style democracy in Africa. They also invited Africans to imagine something entirely different, something rooted in their own history, cultures, and aspirations. That possibility alone is enough to unsettle the old order. Across Africa, the speech has accelerated a debate that was already simmering beneath the surface. For years, critics of the Western model were dismissed as fringe radicals or military opportunists. Now, when a statesman with Odinga's democratic credentials challenges the same system, those critiques acquire legitimacy. University classrooms in Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya have begun hosting open debates about Democracy 2.0. Civil society forums are asking whether imported constitutions can truly capture the complexity of African governance traditions. And in rural villages, radio call-in shows feature ordinary citizens questioning why their daily lives have not improved despite decades of elections. The ripple effect has been profound in the Sahel, where governments led by Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani had already rejected French dominance and Western prescriptions. Odinga's speech provided them with unexpected cover. What critics once dismissed as the rhetoric of military regimes now carries the validation of a civilian elder from East Africa. In Ouagadougou, ministers quoted Odinga in parliamentary debates. In Bamako, panelists on national television called his remarks evidence that Africa is entering an intellectual revolution to match its political one. The symbolic fusion of East and West Africa in this ideological shift is a powerful development that could transform the African Union itself. Global reactions reveal the growing cracks in the balance of power. In Washington, Odinga's comments triggered urgent strategy sessions. Analysts worried that if respected democratic figures echoed Sahelian leaders, America would lose the ideological foundation of its African engagement. Already, think tanks warn of a credibility vacuum that China and Russia are eager to fill. In Brussels, European policymakers faced similar dilemmas. Official statements reaffirmed commitment to democracy, but private reports acknowledged that Africa may be slipping from Europe's influence at a time when the continent's resources are vital for Europe's green transition. China and Russia have wasted no time capitalizing on the moment. Beijing presented Odinga's words as evidence that the Western model is outdated, while quietly offering East African governments expanded infrastructure partnerships. Russia's media outlets praised both Odinga and Traoré as symbols of a multipolar future, while Russian diplomats extended new invitations for African leaders to attend security and policy forums. These moves were not accidental. They reflect an understanding that Africa's political imagination is shifting, and with it, the opportunity to anchor alliances outside the Western orbit. But the consequences are not confined to geopolitics. Within Africa itself, Odinga's speech has fueled a generational awakening. Young people across the continent are demanding not just elections, but governance that delivers tangible improvements. They see roads still unpaved, hospitals without electricity, schools without books, and they are no longer satisfied with ritualistic voting ceremonies. Odinga gave legitimacy to their frustrations, and in doing so, he may have unleashed a wave of demands that traditional elites cannot ignore. In Nairobi, student groups have already begun drafting manifestos for an African-led democratic renewal. In Accra, youth activists are calling for constitutional reviews to align governance with local traditions rather than foreign templates. The implications for the African Union are profound. If the AU cannot reconcile the growing divide between sovereignty-driven governments in the Sahel and more Western-aligned states on the coasts, it risks paralysis or even fragmentation. Some analysts predict the rise of a reformist bloc within the AU, pushing for an updated charter that recognizes multiple models of governance rather than insisting on a single imported version. This could mark the beginning of an African political pluralism that is neither liberal democracy in the Western sense nor outright authoritarianism, but something entirely new. Western governments fear this outcome not only because it would diminish their influence, but also because it exposes vulnerabilities within their own systems. Odinga's warning that democracy is being rejected even in its cradle strikes at the heart of Western self-image. It reminds audiences that populism, polarization, and institutional breakdown are not unique to Africa, but global phenomena. If the West cannot guarantee stability at home, its authority to prescribe solutions abroad becomes tenuous. Still, Odinga did not call for abandoning democracy altogether. His words left space for redefinition rather than rejection. That nuance is critical. Across Africa, few want to return to outright dictatorship. What they want is governance that produces dignity, opportunity, and sovereignty. Whether that takes the form of hybrid models, traditional councils combined with modern institutions, or regional governance experiments, the essential demand is the same: systems that work for Africans, not for donors. This redefinition carries risks as well as opportunities. Without clear frameworks, disillusionment could slide into chaos, enabling opportunists to seize power under the banner of sovereignty. Civil society groups warn that abandoning electoral accountability entirely would open the door to new forms of authoritarianism. Yet even these critics admit that a deep recalibration is inevitable. The broader lesson is that power in the 21st century is not simply about military might or financial leverage. It is about credibility, legitimacy, and the ability to inspire populations. NATO's weapons cannot silence the voices of millions of African youth demanding results. Western aid cannot substitute for roads, jobs, and dignity. And diplomatic platitudes cannot conceal the fact that Africa is demanding a new relationship with itself and with the world. As the dust settles, one truth stands clear. Odinga's speech has become a marker in history. It represents the moment when Africa's debate about democracy shifted from the margins to the mainstream. It symbolizes a continental demand not just for sovereignty over resources, but for sovereignty over ideas. Whether the outcome is renewal, rupture, or reinvention, the trajectory has changed. Africa is no longer content to copy. It is ready to create. When history is written about this decade, Raila Odinga's speech may be remembered as a turning point, not just for Kenya, but for all of Africa. His words pierced through the polite rituals of diplomacy and spoke to a deeper truth. Systems that do not deliver dignity cannot survive. What began as one man's candid reflection now resonates as a continental challenge. Across Africa, people are asking new questions. Why should we cling to imported models that have failed to bring prosperity? Why should we measure progress by elections that change faces but not lives? Why should sovereignty stop at the ballot box, while poverty and dependency remain untouched? These questions do not weaken Africa. They strengthen it, because they signal a generation unwilling to settle for illusions. Odinga did not issue a call to rebellion. He issued a call to honesty. He reminded us that African societies have their own traditions of governance, their own moral codes, and their own visions of justice. He suggested that perhaps the time has come to draw from that heritage and create systems that reflect African realities. That does not mean rejecting democratic values. It means reimagining them in ways that serve the people first. The challenge now belongs to Africa's youth. With more than 70% of the population under 30, the continent's future will not be decided in conference halls, but in classrooms, marketplaces, and streets. Young Africans must decide whether they want to inherit systems that no longer inspire or design new ones that can carry their dreams forward. That choice cannot be outsourced to foreign advisors or external powers. It belongs to Africans alone. For the West, Odinga's speech should serve as a wake-up call. Credibility is not maintained through slogans, but through results. If democracy is to remain meaningful, it must prove its worth in practice, not just in principle. Lectures will not persuade. Respectful partnership, genuine investment, and humility might. To every viewer listening today, the message is clear. Africa is at a crossroads. One path leads back to dependency and disappointment. The other leads toward sovereignty, creativity, and a democracy defined by Africans themselves. The road will not be easy, but history rarely rewards the easy path. If you believe that Africa has the right to choose its destiny, then share this message. If you believe that dignity matters more than borrowed systems, then add your voice to the rising chorus. The silence has already been broken. The question now is who will answer. Family, we have reached the end of this conversation, but in truth this is only the beginning of something much larger. What Raila Odinga did with a single speech was to shake the foundation of a system that has been presented to us as unchangeable. What Ibrahim Traoré has done in Burkina Faso is to prove that leadership can look different when sovereignty is placed above permission. Together, their voices echo a message that cannot be ignored. Africa is ready to define its own future. But this moment is not just about leaders. It is about you. It is about every student who wonders if their vote will ever change their community. It is about every worker who dreams of a life with dignity instead of survival. It is about every parent who wants their children to inherit a continent that does not need to beg to be respected. This is your fight as much as it is theirs. So here is the challenge. Will you stay a spectator, waiting for someone else to write Africa's story? Or will you step forward, in whatever way you can, to claim your place in shaping it? Change does not begin in parliaments alone. It begins in conversations, in communities, in the choices we make every day. If this message has moved you, do not keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your family, your networks. Let the questions raised here spread beyond borders. Subscribe if you believe African voices deserve to be heard on their own terms. Add your comment below and tell us what democracy, sovereignty, and dignity mean to you. Because when we speak together, when we act together, when we believe together, nothing can silence us. Africa's dawn is not coming. It is here. And the only question left is whether you will be part of it.